Hi, I'm Charles Galda, your host for the Church in Action program each week from Vision New England. Welcome back to part 2 of our interview with Pastor Adam DePasquale from Walnut Hill Community Church, talking about awakening in New England.
Yeah.
And so the Great Awakenings that are so connected to New England change the world, because they don't just change the colonies or the states, or they change the world, which just shows the power of even, these in the grand scheme of things, small movements, but from a church perspective, really big movements of God. They're earth shattering.
Yeah. And so many of them happened right here in New England, right?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, the First Great Awakening, you correct me if I'm missing my history, First Great Awakening starts in New England.
Yeah.
Second one, I think, starts in New York, but then hits New England early and just blows out from New England all over the colonies. And I think the third one is also very early in New England, if not just starting here. Am I right?
Yeah, and you're talking about Moody particularly in that.
That age. And actually Vision New England is founded out of the Third Great Awakening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's another great example. You've obviously, we've met together before at the Moody site up there in Massachusetts, and you go there and these just amazing buildings that were schools for boys and girls, really to raise up the next generation. But all of those buildings were made with the money that Moody brought in from his ministry, which was around the world. And so, yeah, it's amazing. It's just the locations you can visit are really amazing.
Yeah. And some of them are quite out in the middle of nowhere today.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what makes it fun to visit them.
Yeah.
I think I'd say this, like studying spiritual history is great because it touches the mind, the heart, and the spirit. That's what I like to say. It touches the mind in that when you have the context to your region in terms of understanding what happens spiritually, it helps you understand why we do the things we do, why there are these things that just would be strange to foreigners. Like, I'll give you an example, like town greens. Why are there churches on town greens, particularly in Connecticut, Massachusetts, right? And the answer to that is because you needed a church in order to start a town, right? And then as that started changing, the churches were built on the green. But, knowing that is really helpful. So definitely studying history is great for context, but then it touches what I would say the heart. And what I mean by that is when you stand, like, for instance, on the green where George Whitefield preached and you see how huge it was, it kind of produces in you a certain desire to be bold, like, wow, Lord, what if, could I have that kind of boldness, or could I have that kind of perseverance? There's a story where George Whitefield is going from one location to preach at another, and he has this terrible horse accident where he falls off and he's like badly injured. He gets up, gets back on the horse, and he preaches the same night. And so, studying that, you learn, wow, perseverance is necessary, right? We know that anyway. And then I would say, mind, heart, spirit, because when you go to these locations and you actually take the time, it's almost like a theology of place. Now, I'm not super mystical, but when you go to a place and you realize that here in this location, the Lord just did a great work, a few hundred years ago, it leads you to pray. And sometimes my prayers will simply be, Lord, do it again. Other times it may be, Lord, here I am, use me whatever way you want. And that leads to a fresh encounter with God. So when you go to these locations, what starts as something that's maybe intellectual, moves to something that touches your heart, and then moves to your spirit as you say, Lord, here I am, would you do it again? And you intercede for the town. So I just think it's awesome to do these kinds of visits.
Well, I think you're echoing something that a pastor from Walnut Hill, a couple of pastors back from you, was conveyed to me, because I wasn't there at the time. He used to say, God is a God of geography. And so geography matters to God. And then the other thing I always go back to is that God is a God of patterns. And so we see patterns all through Scripture. There's a sin pattern, there's a redemption pattern, there's a deliverance pattern. And in New England, there's a great awakening pattern.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that means God plans another great awakening, but I will always quote a professor of mine who would say, what God has done in the past is a model and a promise of what he will do in the future, but he's much too creative to do the same thing the same way twice.
That's true.
And so could there be a great awakening in New England? Maybe, right? We don't know. I wouldn't presume to decide that I knew what God was doing, but it's so interesting. We New Englanders love history. It's such a core value of ours. But because of these things, because it's who we are. It informs who we are, and then it speaks to where we're going.
It does, for sure. Yeah.
And so,
I think we got to pray. Yeah. Let's
yeah.
pray.
Well, so what are some of the common themes you found across Awakening? You'd mentioned young people before. You just said prayer.
Yeah.
I'm guessing those are both themes.
Yeah, certainly, for sure. I mentioned to you that idea of like perseverance. I think that you see that in the way that despite opposition, all the revivalists would press through that opposition and kind of look to the Lord to do these things. I mean, here's another example. Those of you who know Jonathan Edwards' story, by the time he was in his mid-40s, there was such a divide and some theological issues in Northampton that the church forced him to leave. So here he is, and he, where do you go from here? I mean, I'd be pretty discouraged. This was his grandfather's church that he had taken over, right? I mean, there's a lot to be discouraged by. Well, he ends up in Stockbridge, and, it's really out of the way a bit. And amazingly, he starts to minister to the indigenous people, Native Americans of America. What's amazing about that is that earlier in his life, some of his family members had been killed by an attack from Native Americans. And so here he goes and he starts to become a missionary to the very people who, he felt some hurt by. And I think that speaks again to that idea of perseverance. The Lord's not done with me yet. Okay, Lord, what do you want me to do now? And there in that location, he actually writes some of his most important theological, philosophical books. So it's like just when you think it's all over and you're pushed out into, the vast sides of New England from one of the largest churches, God does some of his greatest work through you in the quietness and in the privacy, really, of that ministry. So, I mean, that to me is a really important lesson, the lesson of perseverance. That definitely is there. And then I think just that the lesson that you need to leave room for the Lord. And I hate to even say it that way, but, Jonathan Edwards, when he preached the sinners of an angry God, in the hands of an angry God, the first time he preached it, you can read that it had little to no result at the church he preached. And then it was later when he was in Enfield that he preached it again and all heaven broke out, you might say. And so you're like, well, what was different? Well, Jonathan Edwards often preached from a manuscript in a monotone kind of voice, so it wasn't his delivery. It had something to do with the work of the Holy Spirit in that place at that time and the readiness of the people to receive it. Yeah. And I think that's a really important lesson. So often in New England, I think we try something once and we give up. And the Lord says, keep trying, do it again. And you never know when he's going to work. You never know where. You never know which people are going to be open to the gospel. Our job is to be faithful. Our job is to do the work, of leading and shepherding and preaching. So, I mean, those are definitely some themes that jump out to me.
Are there places that you've been to or stories that you've uncovered, what have you, that you would say, this actually impacted me, impacted my soul in a way I didn't anticipate?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, so many of them, but I would say I'd go back to the Charles Finney stories. Because what was interesting about Charles Finney is that he wanted to be a lawyer. I mean, that was his path and was setting out to be a lawyer. He was in the process of that. And it really was him inquiring of the Lord. There's a great story. He was out in the woods praying, just wrestling with God. And all of a sudden, his heart broke open and he went back to his home and he spent the whole night praying. And, as he writes, he had visitations from heaven. It was like the Lord overwhelming him with his love and taking stuff out of him and putting new stuff in him. He woke up the next day a different man. I mean, he would walk down the street and he would share his faith. He would, all these gifts of, presenting like a lawyer would are now used for the kingdom. It's an immediate shift. And I think for me, sometimes I get appropriately jealous of that, meaning like, Lord, would you do a new thing in me? Would you do something fresh in me for your glory? And so I'm inspired that it's never too late. We should always keep our expectation of the Lord, our hunger for God. We shouldn't ever be satisfied. Paul talks about eagerly desiring the spiritual gifts. And what I take that to mean is eagerly desiring more of the Lord, a closer intimacy with the Lord, a desire to see him move in ways that we could never move, because that's what's needed to see hard soil broken up. And that's what's needed for a revival, not, better sermons per se, although we need great sermons, but it's great sermons with a full surrender to the Lord.
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
Yeah, because we would both say you can do all the preparation, you can have all the hard work, you can have all the right oratory skills, you can have all the right argument skills, and it means nothing unless God is in it.
I wish it weren't that way sometimes,
Yeah, yeah,
because you do work hard, right?
yeah,
And then sometimes it's like almost as if you've done all the hard work and something very simple comes and the Lord decides to move on like the smallest effort, almost just to say it was never about you to begin with. Thanks for all your time and thanks for taking it serious, but I'm going to just move, almost in spite of you, right?
It's a great point, because sometimes there's things I could point to them like, we worked really, really hard at this, and God moves and work really hard too. But then there's been other times where it's like, I have this thought and I don't do anything with it, and 2 months later somebody just hands it to you and you're like, huh. I would like it to be like that more often.
Really, I know.
And so if somebody were to say, well, hey, look, right, they're not going to be able to do what you did, Adam, right? You put so much effort into this and so much. Is there stuff you would say, hey, you ought to read this, or you ought to go here? These are kind of the highlights. Are there some places you would point people to, or resources?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, certainly like getting a copy of George Whitfield's autobiography is a fun experience because you can turn to different days and just read about his day. I think that would whet your appetite. But I would say start in your own town, because every town in New England has some sort of history in it that when you uncover, it just fills you with excitement. I mean, you're like, I had no idea. So I would probably say that. And you could start by going to your local historical society, which there are, almost every town in New England has a historical society. Yeah. And if you tell them what you're looking for, they would probably point you in a good direction. For example, even finding the oldest church in your town and desiring to find out, how did that church start? What were the stories that helped that church? And you will undoubtedly discover some sort of amazing story that will inspire you. Yeah.
And so, some of those churches will have records that are hundreds of years old, just sitting in their basement, and Absolutely. They're happy to have people come take a look at them. They don't mind at all. You and I have a friend. I'm actually doing a session with him after this. We're going to talk about the Cape Awakening.
Wow.
And it was exactly what you're talking about. Somebody was reading a book in a bookstore, mentioned his town, sent it to him. He worked with the historic side, uncovered there was an awakening in that town that was huge back 100 plus years ago.
You would think we've discovered it all, but it's true. Stories get lost, and I think we need to tell them. Right? It's really exciting. Yeah, like when I was researching Jonathan Edwards, I went to his family church where his dad pastored. I mean, no one drives by that church now. It's out. Yeah. It's out of town. It's out of the way. And I contacted the church, and the woman who answered, she was so excited to meet with me. And so every time we've done a revival tour, we've brought them to that church, and someone from the church meets us and just shows off their history and tells about the Lord. It's really fun. You build some really fun relationships that way.
Yeah. We New Englanders don't, if you're only from New England, you may not realize how unique that is, that New England cares so deeply about our history. Other parts of the country think it's, like if you think about California, it's all about what's happening right now. It's all about what's coming tomorrow. Now is too old. Tomorrow is what's important. And we value that history. And I think Baldwin really raises a good point about, our history is always with us, whether we know it or not. It informs how we perceive the world. It informs how we think. It's right. Our history is never something in the past. He argues it's always with us. And so this history informs us even today, even if we're not native New Englanders, right, like us, right? But it because you come in and you absorb the culture, and it's here, both the good and the bad.
The good and the bad.
Yep. Yep. And there's bad in our history. There's a lot of great, but there's bad too. We all know that. And so is there Have you looked at any like because we've talked mostly about stuff that for today it sounds like they're more suburban rural sites. Have
Right.
you looked at some of the what today now is would be an urban context?
Yeah, well, I mean, so we just talked about Boston. So much happened in Boston. The sites where you can see George Whitefield preaching, history of Park Street Church, all these kinds of things. Even visiting the site, for instance, where D.L. Moody gave his life to Jesus, there's actually a plaque on a building in Boston downtown where you can visit that. Most people walk by it every day in a busy street. They never know it's there. So, yeah, I mean, these things were happening not only in the rural areas, but in the urban areas as well. I mean, pretty amazing.
And there is a group, I don't know how often they do it, but they do a kind of Black church history tour in Boston too.
Wow.
Because Boston has New England's first Black church. It has its right, so it's got a very rich history. Martin Luther King was a preacher in Boston for a period of time. So there's a lot of connection there when you start breaking into the kind of subcultures of the church. And the Latino church and a lot of the immigrant churches. So there's just so much. And to your point, we lose a lot of it because, we're not documenting everything that happens in our churches. We're doing what God's calling us to do, and we're living our lives, and we lose it. And so it's so fascinating when you dig back into it and you start sharing those things with us. And so what's the coolest story you would say?
Cool story historically or something?
That yeah, historically, of the stuff you've uncovered, what was it's like, never knew that, or I don't think anybody knows this one.
Wow. That's a good one. Well, I would just say this to you, like Rhode Island has an incredible amount of spiritual history that is fun to visit. And Rhode Island is very different because, as many people would know, folks were sent to Rhode Island, kind of cast out of Massachusetts, as it were. And so there was
the Catholics in particular, right?
Yeah, I mean everyone. I mean,
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Roger Williams.
We came for religious freedom. Now, of course, not we, but we came for religious freedom, as one person said, but for us and not for anybody else who's here. And those people, so we were throwing people out.
Yes.
To Rhode Island because they were heretics.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, so the Baptist movement are there. A lot of independent. Okay. So where Connecticut has lots of congregational churches, Massachusetts, Rhode Island has lots of independent Baptist churches, because there's a spirit of independence there. But there's a great story about Anne Hutchinson. I always knew Hutchinson from the Hutchinson Parkway growing up closer to New York City, and I never really knew the story. But, Anne was a really powerful woman of God early on in New England history, preaching Bible studies, all these kinds of things. And she was really forced out of Massachusetts into Rhode Island. And so you can trace some of her steps in Rhode Island and even visit like a memorial site related to her. So I find that I never knew that. I think there's a side to even the history of women in ministry that you can glean that is within New England. It's very powerful.
Yeah. Salvation Army, that applies to.
Yeah.
And Chris Gepner, people can look back to a prior episode. Chris Gepner shared a story about Samson Occam, who is not somebody I knew, but is a Native American who gets saved and becomes a really big deal preacher. And I believe it was Whitefield took him back to England, and he preached all over England, raising money that was then used to start Dartmouth College.
I love that.
Right. And of course, all the colleges came out of churches back then.
Yeah. And there, I mean, speaking of that, like, a lot of these colleges are now going back to their roots, and there are dedicated followers of Jesus on these main campuses. And it wouldn't surprise me if part of this next revival in New England comes from the college campuses. I think that would be true.
Yeah. There is, I don't know if I'm at liberty to name names, but there is someone you and I both know who's been in college ministry at one of the most elite schools in the country for years. And has always been trying to figure out how do we get connected to young people when they show up on campus sooner. And a year or so ago, got called in by the dean of students and said, hey, we want to figure out how we can connect our students to your ministry sooner. How do we do that?
Yeah.
Only prayer. 20 years it took. Only prayer gets you to that point.
Well,
it's all these young people's stories that we keep hearing.
And to that point, I mean, this past year, I was asked to kind of participate in a gathering happening at Harvard University with what they call their Daniel Fellows. And this is something, you talked about something I didn't know. Their Daniel Fellows program seeks to identify like Daniels of the current age, young people who are studying, learning, want to see the Lord move through their lives in powerful ways. And I was in a room with, close to 100 of these Daniel fellow students and alumni at Harvard University who are praying, worshiping with such might. It was one of the most powerful worship experiences I've been a part of in a long time. And I sat there going, I had no idea. Like, I had no idea that this is what so much of my exposure is what's happening in the church, not in the educational sphere. But I said, wow, this is what's happening in the educational sphere. God's up to something really, really good. It's going to be special.
Our picture of those places is what you read in the news media, which is so politicized and partisan. And there's a lot of things wrong in American education for sure. There's some amazing things happening with young people on colleges, campuses right now, including the most elite schools. And so that's really cool. And so Adam, a couple minutes left.
Yeah.
What's a story that you've seen God do something, whether it's in your life, your family, Walnut Hill, someplace that you think is an interesting story to share with folks?
I don't know. Just something that comes to my mind right now is just a new movement in the area of the arts. You know that I'm currently pursuing a doctor of ministry at Gordon Conwell, and they have a program focused on the arts, ministry, and mission that I'm involved in. And so I think something cool is happening right now as the Lord is recalling artists to take their place of influence in culture. The way I like to say it is this, that every person every day is listening to music, podcasts, news reports, movies, TV shows, social media posts, and they all come through the hands or eyes of an artist. And yet the church has not done a great job of shaping, forming, investing in artists. So we're trying something new here at the church, which is exciting in that we're trying to identify and invest in the upcoming artists. We're blessed here that we have dancers, actors, musicians, writers, visual artists. And I think that there's something really special happening. So I think that the arts are going to be part of this next revival we're going to see. Artists tend to be very sensitive to what the Lord is doing. So you have to create space for them. They're not going to necessarily force their way into your church. And yet, when you make room for them, throughout history, we see that some of the greatest works of arts have come through the church, and they still to this day are being seen. The arts have a way of displaying God's message and bringing it to life in a way that sometimes our preaching doesn't do. And so, anyway, all that to say, I'm very excited by that, and I think we should be investing more in the area of the arts.
Yeah, it's interesting. You and I both heard James Chung, and he's done episodes of the Church in Action too, and he talks about the generation that cares about what is beautiful is this next generation coming up. And there does seem to be an increasing focus, and what you guys are doing at Walnut Hill is kind of the tip of the spear of the arts. But he also would say it's that generation that typically experiences revival. And so again, we're not going to predict what God's going to do, but it's interesting, a lot of things lining up in interesting ways these days.
Yeah, amen.
And so, Adam, thank you so much. Thanks for for taking time to talk to us today. Thanks for your leadership and ministry at Walnut Hill, in Vision New England, in so many spheres. Thanks for our partnership in ministry. Thanks for our friendship. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, Charles.
This program is created by Vision New England, which accelerates evangelism by helping the church work in unity to make disciples, do justice, and share Jesus, so New England will be transformed by the love of Jesus. You can find additional resources and support our mission at visionnewengland.org. We want to thank our friends at World Vision, who are celebrating 75 years of God's faithfulness and trusting Him with a worldwide vision to end extreme poverty for children everywhere. Join us next Sunday at 2 p.m. on Life Changing Radio. Thank you, and God bless you.
At Leadership Transformations, we believe that when you have the right resources to help you slow down and experience a deep and refreshing connection to God, you can become the discerning leader you know you are created to be. Friends, Steve Macchia here, and I have a free gift for your soul. It's called Pathways. Pathways is our weekly email aimed at offering you soul-nourishing content for the journey. It contains readings, prayers, spiritual practices, a link to the Discerning Leader podcast, as well as information about all of our upcoming soul care retreats, workshops, and online offerings. So head on over to leadershiptransformations.org today and sign up for this free resource. It will help you slow down and be more. God bless you, friends.